Chapter 1. Footsteps in the Frost. The wind came down from the hills like a curse. It howled through the jagged pine ridges and buried hollers of Marrow Creek, a forgotten speck of a town swallowed by the belly of the Appalachian wilderness. The winter had arrived a full month early, cruel and unrelenting. Snow piled thick on rooftops, drifted high along the broken wooden fences, and turned the single-lane mountain road that wound its way into the town into a suffocating, impassable grave of ice. No one was getting in, no one was getting out. The townsfolk, what was left of them, had huddled down early this year, their breath turning to fog inside their own homes as firewood ran low. Marrow Creek was a relic, a mining town bled dry long ago by corporations that had vanished with the gold and coal they craved. What remained was rot, hollow-eyed buildings sagging under the weight of snow, and people who knew how to survive the dark. But this winter, this was different. The whispers began the second week into the snowfall. At first, folks said it was the wind, always the wind. It moaned like a dying animal through the narrow mountain passes. But there was a cadence to it, a rhythm, a sound that seemed to call out names. "Etta," someone whispered on the porch of the old general store. "It said my wife's name, like it knew her." No one laughed. No one dismissed it. In Marrow Creek, you didn't joke about the woods. Soon after came the footsteps. Bipedal, too heavy for a deer, too slow for a bear, just beyond the tree line, always just far enough away not to see. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Every night, always circling, always watching. Whatever it was, it didn't shy away from the cold. It lived in it. It was Eli Carter, the trapper, who came back first. He'd been gone 3 days, hunting up near Dagger's Bend, where even the moon refused to shine. When he burst through the doors of the Rusted Stag Tavern that night, a flurry of snow riding in behind him, the crowd fell silent. His eyes were wild. Not from drink. Eli hadn't touched liquor since his brother froze to death out past Raven Ridge. His coat was torn down the front like something had raked across it, and his boots were soaked in blood that hadn't yet dried. "Something's up there," he rasped. "Something wrong." The barkeep, Gentry, stepped forward. "What do you see?" Eli swallowed. His Adam's apple bobbed. A man, but not a man. Long arms, bent the wrong way, skin stretched too tight over its bones. Its mouth, it was too wide. It whispered at me, even while it was chewing. "Chewing what?" Gentry asked. Eli shuddered. "Something's bones." He left before anyone could stop him, muttering about sealing his doors with salt and fire. The last anyone saw of him was his lantern bobbing through the snow as he made his way toward the edge of town. Morning came, bleak and iron gray. The sun tried to rise, but never quite broke through the clouds. The air was sharp enough to cut skin, and the snow had deepened overnight, muffling the world in a thick, white hush. Deputy Lane found him first, lying by the edge of his cabin, frozen to the earth like a statue. What was left of him? Eli Carter's face was torn clean off, as if peeled by claws. His eyes were gone, sockets hollowed and black. His ribs had been cracked open, his chest cavity picked clean, a grotesque hollow where heart and lungs once beat. His legs were gnawed down to the femur, exposed bone protruding from gristle like splintered ice. Around him, pressed perfectly into the snow, were footprints, large, human-shaped, barefoot. But they weren't walking away. They were walking toward him from the forest, from the deep woods where the sunlight never touched. The snow was too fresh to lie. Whatever had come for Eli had come under cover of the whispering night, dragged itself out of the trees and feasted. A trail of red marked its return. And on the edge of the forest, just beyond where the footprints vanished into the pines, the snow lay untouched, pristine. But those who stood there swore the air was colder, that they could still hear the whisper, too low to understand, but too close to ignore. Something ancient had stirred in the winter dark, and Murrow Creek had been heard. Chapter 2. The Town That Watches. The frost never left Eli Carter's body. Even after they carried what remained of him into the ice house behind the old church, even after Sheriff Calloway covered him with thick wool and locked the door behind him, the frost clung like a second skin, a pale shimmer across his fleshless face, a crystalline layer inside his hollow chest. It was as if the cold had soaked into his bones and taken up residence there, something ancient, patient, and cruel. Sheriff Calloway lit a cigarette with trembling fingers as he stepped outside, his breath fogging in front of him like a dying ghost. The sky hung low and colorless. No birds, no wind. Just a silence so heavy it pressed against the chest like a weight. The footprints still hadn't melted. He crouched at the forest's edge again that morning, studying them like a man trying to understand a message written in a dead language. The shape was wrong, human, but wrong. The toes were too long, the arch too high. There were claw marks, not sharp like a cat, but cracked and splintered, as if the nails were rotted but driven deep into the frozen soil anyway. They weren't scattered like an animal's. They walked a perfect, deliberate path, one direction in, one direction out, and the stride, adding jippy. Calloway measured it. 6 feet between steps, at least. Whatever this thing was, it walked like it knew it belonged here. He crushed the cigarette under his boot and stared into the trees. Something stared back. By midweek, 5 goats, 3 cows, and a family's entire chicken coop had vanished. No blood, no tracks leading away, just silence and broken wooden slats, feathers drifting in the wind like falling ash. The animals hadn't run. They'd been taken. In town, the unease thickened. People started keeping their curtains drawn, doors locked, even in daylight. Every conversation began in whispers, as if the thing might be listening. At the diner, someone started a rumor that Eli hadn't been eaten by an animal, but by one of them. That someone in Murrow Creek had finally snapped. A miner gone mad, maybe. A drifter who never left. Or worse, something worse, wearing a man's face. Sheriff Calloway tried to shut it down, but fear doesn't listen to badges. It was the Whitlow boy, just 7 years old, who first heard the whispering. He told his mother at breakfast. Said a voice had come to his window just before dawn. Said it called his name. Not like how you say it, he said, eyes wide and trembling. It stretched it out like it was chewing it. She slapped him, told him not to lie about such things. But that night he pissed the bed, and the next morning they found tiny handprints, bare and frozen on the frost outside his window. Hands too small for a man, too warped for a child. 3 fingers, 1 thumb, 1... something else. The sheriff went to Mabel Rowan. The townsfolk called her the lore keeper, an old widow who hadn't left her crumbling house on the hill in over a year. They said she was part Cherokee, part liar, and mostly mad. But she remembered the old stories, and that was enough for Calloway. Her home smelled of smoke, damp earth, and mold. Animal bones hung from the ceiling on fraying twine. Her fireplace crackled with blue flame, fed with herbs he didn't recognize. She didn't let him speak first. "It's come back," she said, looking into the fire. "I told my husband when I saw the birds vanish. He didn't listen. He's buried behind the house now." Calloway stayed quiet. Mabel reached into a cedar box and pulled out a drawing. Rough charcoal on yellowed paper. A tall, skeletal creature, with arms like branches and a mouth that stretched too wide. Empty black pits where eyes should be. Antlers or maybe twisted bone. "Wendigo," she said. "It comes when hunger grows strong. When people get desperate. When the cold's too deep, and something old wakes up in the woods." "A spirit." "A curse," she said. "A hunger so big it swallows the soul. It was a man once, maybe, but it ain't now." She looked up at him then, her eyes cataract-blued but sharp as broken glass. "And it don't just eat meat. It eats warmth, trust, hope. It watches until you turn on each other. Then it feeds." By nightfall, Marrow Creek was unraveling. Someone smashed the window of the tanner's truck, accusing them of hoarding food. Fistfights broke out in front of the general store. Mrs. Keegan swore she saw her husband standing in the backyard, swaying side to side, but he'd been dead 5 years. The local pastor tried to hold a prayer circle, but when a woman began speaking in tongues and clawing her own face, he fled. The sheriff walked the streets, watching the town turn into a cold, shaking animal. People moved like shadows, flinching at sounds, at each other. The whispering hadn't stopped. It seemed to follow the wind now, slithering between buildings. And then came the screams. 2 of them. One high and wet, one cut short, like a snapped rope. They found the bodies at the edge of the mill road. Anna and Grady Kinney, brother and sister, both in their 20s, both wide-eyed and silent in death. Their mouths were torn open, lips flayed back so far it exposed their molars. Their hands were missing, and their skin had taken on that same frostbite shimmer, like glass laid over raw meat. But the worst part was their faces. They weren't just frozen in terror. They were smiling. Wide, impossibly wide, like something had taken hold of their muscles and forced joy into their final expressions. Their eyes bulged, their cheeks torn by the stretch, like their last breath was a laugh they didn't want to give. Beside them, in the snow, were more footprints. Not one set, several, and this time they circled the bodies. Not fleeing, not hunting, out watching. Sheriff Calloway looked up at the woods. Something was out there, and it was no longer alone. Chapter 3. Hunger. The forest didn't whisper anymore. It breathed. A long, slow exhale of frost and shadow that seeped from the trees like poisoned gas, curling around Marrow Creek, slipping under doors, and rotting the last nerve endings of a town already teetering on the edge of madness. People weren't sleeping anymore. Fires died too fast. The snow grew deeper every night despite the still skies. No birds sang. Even the crows had fled. Sheriff Calloway hadn't slept in 36 hours. Not properly. He stood in the town square beneath a dying lantern, the light above him flickering like a nervous eye. Around him, 7 others gathered, bundled in furs, rifles across shoulders, axes at their belts. They didn't speak. What was there left to say? The Kinney siblings had been buried in frozen ground without ceremony. 3 more people had gone missing since. Gone, not dead. No screams, no tracks. Just gone. But Calloway knew they were somewhere in the woods. And he was going to find them. Mabel arrived last, swaddled in a threadbare coat lined with feathers, and lined again with strange charms that clinked like teeth when she walked. Around her neck hung a crude talisman of antler and bone, smeared with something red and glistening. Her eyes looked black in the lantern light. "You sure you're ready for what's in there?" she asked. "No," Calloway answered. "But I'm going." They moved as one through the snow, boots crunching softly in unison, a line of breath and fear carving a trail into the timbered dark. The forest was silent, except for the creak of old branches and the far-off thud of something too heavy to be falling snow. Grady Milner, a wiry mechanic, led the way with a lantern. His eyes never stopped darting left to right. Beside him was Harper, the sawmill's forewoman, whose axe was already slick with blood. She'd used it the week before to kill a stray hound that went mad and tore through the marketplace. The trees grew thicker, the trunks blackened by old soot from fires long since forgotten. Strange shapes hung from some, twine-wrapped bundles of sticks, feathered dolls, scraps of old deer hide with runes carved deep into them. Mabel muttered something under her breath every time they passed one. "Wards," she whispered. "Old wards, but broken." "By what?" Calloway asked. She looked at him with eyes like sinkholes. "By hunger. They found the cave 6 hours in. It wasn't marked on any map. It didn't show up on old mining charts. It was hidden beneath a collapsed ridge, concealed by drifts of snow and heavy underbrush. But Mabel walked right to it, like she'd known it was waiting for them all along. It yawned open in the rock like a wound. The entrance was just wide enough for a man to slip through sideways, jagged and cragged with frost-crusted icicles that looked like fangs. From within, a slow breath of cold air exhaled outward, thick with the scent of rot, damp soil, and blood that had frozen and unfrozen too many times. Grady raised the lantern and stepped inside. Then he screamed. The others rushed in after him and stopped short. The walls were lined with bones, hundreds of them, not laid to rest, not piled, arranged, hung from the walls by strips of sinew, skulls polished and set like trophies into nooks, femurs splintered, ribs curved into symbols none of them could read. Some of the bones still had scraps of flesh on them, dried to leather. Others glistened, still wet. Something had been feeding recently. Calloway's breath hitched. The light caught on carvings, ancient symbols, etched into the rock in sweeping circular patterns. The more he looked at them, the more his head hurt. They shimmered in and out of shape like they were moving, even though the rock beneath was solid. "Don't read them," Mabel warned sharply. "Don't let 'em in." But it was already too late for Grady. He stood at the far wall, his lantern on the ground, hands trembling. "I see it," he murmured. "I see it watching me." Something moved in the dark. A blur, a rustle, a scrape of bone on stone. Then, nothing. Grady turned. His eyes were wide and white. Behind. He was yanked backward into the black so fast it made a cracking sound. The others shouted, rushed forward, lanterns flailing. They found blood smeared along the stone, and a single boot, still laced, twitching. Harper screamed, firing into the dark. The muzzle flash lit up a silhouette, tall, impossibly thin, with joints that bent the wrong way, like a man broken 100 times and reassembled without care. It had no eyes, just pits. But in the instant the light hit it, Calloway saw a human face, stretched across its skull like a mask. Grady's face. The Wendigo fled into the black with a rattling hiss. Panic erupted. Harper turned to run, but slipped on the blood. Something caught her ankle and dragged her screaming down the tunnel, the sound of her axe clattering behind her. Her shrieks were cut off by a wet snap, like a tree limb breaking. Calloway grabbed Mabel and ran. The others followed, or tried to. A scream behind them was cut short, ending in gurgling silence. Bones crunched underfoot. The tunnels turned and twisted, impossible to map, the markings blurring and spinning. Then, everything went white. Calloway was standing alone in a clearing of snow, though he had no memory of exiting the cave. The trees around him were ash-gray, leafless, swaying, though there was no wind. And there, across from him, stood the Wendigo. Now he could see it fully. Emaciated. Skin so tight it showed every rib and tendon, stretched across a frame that stood nearly 10 feet tall. Its limbs were elongated, fingers like branches, ending in hooked claws. Its chest was a hollow drum that breathed inward but never seemed to exhale. But the worst were its eyes. They were human, not in shape or color, but in expression. Despair, hunger, awareness. It stared at him and spoke without opening its maw, a whisper that curled inside his skull. I remember warmth. I remember my name. I remember eating the ones I loved first. Calloway dropped to his knees, clutching his head. The whisper grew louder, layered voices of dozens, maybe hundreds, screaming and weeping and begging. He saw flashes. A man lost in a snowstorm, gnawing his brother's leg to survive. A woman offering her baby to the fire so she wouldn't starve. A cabin buried in snow, filled with laughter turned to screams. The Wendigo came closer, towering above him. "You will join me. You will remember too." Then, silence. Calloway woke up at the edge of the forest, covered in blood that wasn't his, shaking violently. Mabel lay beside him, unconscious but breathing. The others were gone. Forever. The sheriff staggered to his feet, eyes glassy, throat dry. The hunger had spoken, and it had remembered him. Whispers at the door. The first house went down just after midnight. A terrible sound tore through the silence of Marrow Creek. Wood cracking, glass shattering, screams rising like steam from boiling flesh. Then silence, sharp and suffocating, fell back over the town like a blanket soaked in ice water. By the time Sheriff Calloway arrived, there was nothing left of the Parker cabin but splinters and blood. The structure had been ripped apart from the top down, like a bear had swiped its claws through a dollhouse. One wall dangled off its hinges, doors gone, roof caved inward. The snow around the ruin was painted in wide streaks of red and brown, staining the ground like rusted rivers. They found Janice Parker's body tangled in the snowdrift behind the house, spine snapped, limbs twisted so far around her torso that she looked more like a shattered marionette than a woman. Her eyes were gone, scooped clean from the sockets. Her mouth was frozen open, as if mid-scream, her jaw split from the strain. Her husband and baby were missing. No blood trail, no prints. Only the ragged impression of something massive that had crawled across the snow on all fours, dragging itself from house to house like a leech. The Wendigo had stopped watching. It had started hunting. By the third night, 7 homes were empty. Some were torn open. Some were left pristine, doors unlocked and fires still burning, with no signs of struggle inside, only the absence of everyone who had been there before. One had been locked from the inside. Inside they found 3 bodies in the bed, arms wrapped around each other, throats slit clean with a kitchen knife. On the wall above them was scrawled, in something dark and flaking, "It won't take what's already dead." The town had turned on itself. Some people boarded their homes shut and lit fires that never stopped burning, even as the wood ran low. Others took to roaming the streets with hunting rifles and hatchets, looking for eyes that weren't quite right, or footprints that didn't match the snow. A boy was hanged from a tree behind the church. They said he'd smiled too wide. No one claimed to have done it. Inside the sheriff's station, the air was thick with smoke and fear. Calloway hadn't spoken since he came back from the woods. Not about what he'd seen, not about what he'd heard. But the mark it left on him was clear. A ragged gash across his chest that never bled, never healed, pulsing faintly beneath his shirt like a second heartbeat. He saw things now when he blinked too long. Faces in the corners, fingers in the shadows, his own reflection staring too long. Mabel sat across from him at the desk, her hands shaking as she unfolded an old piece of parchment wrapped in oiled cloth. "It's not invincible," she said, voice rasping through cracked lips. It's old, starving, desperate. That's why it's hunting here. That's why it's broken its own rules. Calloway looked up slowly, his face hollow. It has rules? They all do, Mabel whispered. But this one's dying. It doesn't want to go back to the cold it came from, so it's clawing at the seams, trying to stay. She pushed the parchment across the table. On it was a diagram, a circle of ash, blood, fire, and sacrifice, with lines of text written in a language that twisted if you looked too long. "These can bind it," she said, "but not kill it. You can't kill hunger. You can only chain it, put it back in the earth until the next famine calls it forth." Calloway touched the edge of the parchment. His fingers tingled. His vision swam. "What kind of sacrifice?" Mabel's eyes locked with his. "Home. Given freely. One that knows it's feeding the dark." Word of the ritual spread through town like fire through dry pine, and like fire, it brought destruction. Some wanted to flee, to make a break through the snow-covered pass, despite the odds. Others said they should fight, to set traps, to burn the forest, to go down shooting. Some just gave up. You could see them standing at their windows, unmoving, waiting, their fires cold, their eyes vacant. But then came the breaking point. The Holloways, a family of 5, good people, were accused of harboring the creature. A girl in town swore she saw their youngest, a boy of 8, walking into the woods at night and returning unmarked. His parents begged, pleaded. The mob didn't care. Sheriff Calloway arrived just in time to see fire catch on their roof. It was too late. Gunshots cracked. Screams followed. Someone threw a Molotov through the front window. The flames caught instantly, dry wood, old varnish, desperation. A man tried to crawl from the inferno, one arm melted to the bone, but a boot stomped his head back into the flame. The house collapsed within minutes. Only one body was recovered. The rest were ashes and smiling skulls, pulled from the wreckage like discarded masks. That night, the whispers came back. But this time, they weren't coming from the woods. They were coming from inside the town, inside walls, beneath floorboards, through vents and cracks and knotholes, and everyone who heard them smiled. Chapter 5. The Cold Never Leaves. Snow fell like ash over Marrow Creek. It came down heavy that morning, blanketing the town in silence so complete it felt like the earth had stopped breathing. Every roof, every tree, every splintered ruin was buried in white. No footprints, no sound. Just the cold and the ever-present hush of something waiting. Inside the sheriff's station, Sheriff Calloway stood before the fire, his face drawn and gray, his badge hanging from his coat like a dead thing. His left hand trembled. He didn't try to hide it. Mabel stood beside him, hunched over the ritual scroll, murmuring the words again and again like a mantra. Her voice was barely human now, rasping, wet, as though her throat were filled with phlegm and dirt. "The hunger must be fed," she whispered, "but it must be fed with willing flesh. The circle only binds what is offered, never taken." Calloway clenched his jaw. "I'll do it." Mabel paused, eyes wide. "You know what that means?" "I do," he said. "This town, it's already lost too much." He reached for the talisman she'd carved, the ring of ash and sinew, the bone needle still wet with his own blood. Outside, the wind howled. They would lure it to the old mine, the place where the mountain had first been wounded, where men had once dug into the rock and pulled out the guts of the earth, where something ancient had likely awakened. They would bury it again. The mine lay on the northern ridge, forgotten and black. Snow draped its rusted mouth like a veil. Old mining carts sat frozen in time, their wheels locked with ice, their contents long turned to rot. The steel entrance gates had been torn apart years ago. Now only jagged remnants jutted from the ground like ribs. The townsfolk stood in a wide circle, their torches forming a ring of flickering orange in the white dark. No one spoke. Some wept quietly. Others prayed. A few stared into the forest, waiting for something they knew they wouldn't see, until it was too late. Calloway stood at the mine's threshold, surrounded by symbols etched in blood and ash, candles burning low, the ritual parchment pinned to the ground by 4 shards of bone. "I offer myself," he said aloud, voice echoing through the valley. "I give what is mine, my body, my breath, my warmth." The wind picked up. The fire danced. And then a voice. Not Calloway's, not Mabel's. Small, fragile, steady. "No, it has to be me." All eyes turned. Ethan Whitlow, just 10 years old, stepped into the circle. His coat was too big, hanging from his shoulders like a shroud. In his hand he held a rabbit's foot. Around his neck was a carved pendant, one Mabel had given him weeks before. His eyes were calm. Mabel's face crumpled. "No, no, child, it must be blooded. It must be willing but not innocent. You don't understand." "I do," Ethan said. He looked at Calloway. "It whispered to me every night, said it remembers me, that it wants me. It said I was the only one it hadn't taken yet, because I hadn't let it in." He stepped into the center of the ritual circle. "I let it in now." The wind stopped. The snow hung suspended in the air, each flake motionless, as though time itself had forgotten to move. Then the trees bent inward. Not from wind, but from pressure. An unseen weight passed through the forest like a god dragging its knuckles through the canopy. Branches snapped, trunks split, the torches guttered, their flames reaching out like frightened hands. And then it came, the Wendigo. It didn't run, it didn't crawl, it glided. Its limbs dragging behind it like broken stilts, its ribs flaring with each breath like a bellows. Its skin hung in ribbons, torn from too many winters. And behind its skull-like face stretched the hollow mask of a man, a memory of what it once was. It stood across from Ethan, and the boy never flinched. The creature opened its mouth. From within poured whispers. Hundreds, thousands, shrieking and weeping and praying and begging. Voices that had died long ago but remained, trapped within its belly. "I remember you, little warmth, little light. Come to me. Be mine." Ethan lifted the rabbit's foot. "I'm already yours." With a final breath, he knelt. The Wendigo lunged. The ritual circle ignited in a wall of flame and shadow. The ground buckled, splitting down the middle, a chasm opening beneath the mine like the mouth of the mountain, screaming in pain. The creature shrieked, not in rage, but in fear, the first emotion it had shown in centuries. It was being pulled. Claws gouged the stone, its body contorting, limbs snapping as it fought to stay above ground. The whispers grew louder, unintelligible now, layered and desperate. Ethan vanished in the light, consumed in fire that turned to ash, that turned to wind that vanished into the dark. Then, with one final wretched howl, the Wendigo was swallowed whole. The mine collapsed. The circle shattered. Silence. 3 years passed. The snow came lighter each year. The whispering stopped. Fires burned longer. Marrow Creek rebuilt, slowly but surely. Calloway never took off the pendant Ethan wore. He kept it in a box next to his bed. Sometimes, on the coldest nights, he swore he heard faint whispers through the wood, but they never said his name again. 20 years later, A small house stood where the Whitlow cabin once had, rebuilt with fresh wood and soft yellow light pouring from its windows. A child played by the fireplace, her laughter bouncing off the walls. Her mother, Etta, grown and strong, stood in the doorway, sipping tea, smiling. Then she heard it. So soft, so quiet. A whisper. A voice she hadn't heard since childhood. It's Etta. She turned toward the window. Outside, in the untouched snow beneath the porch, was a footprint. Human-shaped. The bear, well worn,